Okay, here it is. Somewhere. Okay, recording starts. Okay.
Okay.
All right.
12 o'clock. Good. Okay.
Hello. Welcome. My name is Manuela Achilles. I am an associate professor of German and History at the University of Virginia and the director of UVA's Center for German Studies and the European Studies program. Today, it's my great pleasure and honor to host the inaugural event of our new collaboratory for German studies in Virginia. The collaboratory, or short CGSV, is a partnership among the German programs of the University of Mary Washington, the University of Virginia, the Virginia Commonwealth University, Virginia Tech, and William & Mary. Together, we strive to promote interest in the language and cultures of the German-speaking countries for students, faculty, and the broader community throughout the Commonwealth of Virginia and beyond. This is a very new endeavor, and we invite you to learn more about us, for example, by visiting our Facebook page and to join our partnership. Our first initiative is this speaker series on the new normal, Germany and the US now. It is perhaps quite fitting that we would start our conversation on the new normal with a panel on a state of emergency, Ausnahmezustand. And I hope we will have a lively discussion with our panelists. If you have questions or comments for our speakers, please enter them into the Q&A box, which you should see at the bottom of your screen. Before introducing the speakers in more detail, I would like to acknowledge VCU's doctoral program in Media, Art and Text as the co-sponsor of today's event. I would also like to give a shout out to Professor Marcel Rotter of the University of Mary Washington, who is somewhere here in the background making sure that the technology works. Marcel is the engine that drives our new collaboratory, and we are deeply grateful for his engagement and leadership. Now, finally, let me introduce our panelists, and I introduce them in reverse order. Our invited guest who will speak second is Dr. Martin Klebes, who is a professor of German at the University of Oregon. Martin is the author of a book on Wittgenstein's novels, and he is the translator of works by Hannah Arendt and Ernst Wilhelm Handler. He is also the editor of the digital interdisciplinary journal Konturen, which focuses on phenomena involving borders and limits. Some of his recent article publications have dealt with Thomas Bernhard and William Geddes, Hermann Broch, and Hannah Arendt. Much of Martin's work is concerned with intertextuality, particularly regarding the relation between literary and philosophical texts. Our first speaker today, who will introduce some of the themes of this panel, is Dr. Oliver Speck from the Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond. Oliver is a professor of film studies and the director of VCU's interdisciplinary doctoral program in media, art, and text. His list of publications includes many striking titles, including Funny Frames, The Cinematic Concepts of Tarantino's Django Unchained, the continuation of meta-cinema. One of his current research interests revolves around films that treat virtual reality as an alternative consciousness, such as Total Recall and The Matrix. So without further ado, Oliver, the screen is yours.
Thanks for having me. And please let me know if you have trouble understanding me. I will show a brief slide in a few minutes. So I want to keep this very short. It's just a little introduction for those in the audience who are not familiar with Giorgio Agamben. And since its original publication in 1995 and subsequent translations into other languages, Giorgio Agamben's Homo Sacer project has drawn a lot of critical attention. A brief contribution will explore Giorgio Agamben's concept of the permanent state of exception, which is a direct translation of the German Der Ausnahmezustand, which in English is normally rendered as a state of emergency. In 1922, Carl Schmitt, the infamous, I have to say, German jurist and political theorist, published a work entitled Political Theology. The often quoted opening sentences, and I will share my screen briefly with you. In this often quoted first two sentences of this book, he actually says, in 1922, sovereign is he who decides on the state of exception. Only this definition can do justice to the concept of sovereignty as a borderline concept. And it's my own translation. The translated word is not quite precise enough. So Grenzbegriff here, I chose borderline concept. And this is important for Agamben. You can see, I think, that the seductive power of this statement is really a binary definition. It becomes immediately clear. So that's why I call it, it has a certain seductive power, right? There is a position of leadership, and whoever occupies this position of leadership can suspend the law by declaring a state of emergency. Example that comes to mind is, of course, the recent coup d'etat in Myanmar, or it used to be called Burma in colonial times, right? Military takes over, immediately declares a state of emergency for the next year. Here in the States, the constitutional power of the American president to pardon offenses against the United States. This definition, however, is of course not really binary, right? It just appears as this, and Agamben draws attention to this Grenzbegriff, this border, right? Borderline, a limit concept. So if you know a little bit of Agamben, he talks a lot about thresholds, limits, and this, according to Agamben, is of course a rather dangerous precedent set by especially the Nazis, especially of course Hitler. One precedent that's still perpetrated today is the creation of in-between spaces where de facto people can be kept in legal limbo. So we don't have prisoners who, have certain rights still according to the penal code. No, it's basically camp inmates where you could be held indefinitely. Agamben brings up Guantanamo Bay a lot, right? So you're in legal limbo, you're reduced to what Agamben calls a bare life. That means all your rights are taken away. All that rests is basically the body, your life, and you're lawless, basically. In this sense. So again, for Giorgio Agamben, the concentration camp is what lies at the end of a process that began long before the camps were created, and a process that showed its effects only at the height of modernity. So here comes for him the figure of the so-called Homo sacer, which according to Agamben lies at the heart of Western law and politics. And it's a human who is banned from the community and, as Agamben stresses, can be killed, but not sacrificed. So it's basically without any value. So here my last quote, I promise, and let me share my screen again, so you can hopefully read with me here. So Agamben summarizes his arguments. He's actually, I love the way he writes. He's very concise. He always repeats his arguments. He sums himself up. And this is the last chapter of his book, Homo sacer. So one, the original political relation is the ban, state of exception, a zone of indistinction between outside and inside, exclusion and inclusion. The fundamental activity of sovereign power is the production of bare life as originary political element and as threshold of articulation between nature and culture, zoe and bios. Today it is not the city, but rather the camp that is the fundamental biopolitical paradigm of the West. So to put it completely bluntly, right, he says basically, right now, in politics, we have the same basis as we had in fascist Germany. And in a way, this is an enormous explanatory power that comes from his work. And right, so he says that states nowadays, totalitarian and democratic alike, you do not proclaim enemies of the state directly. It's not a simple us-them. It's more that right, there is no longer an outside to the state. Because if you say, well, us versus them, you could still basically say, okay, could expel those people we don't like. But he said the modern state is more like a machine that works to abolish the outside, right? It tries to get into everything in every aspect of life. So when you have that Speech Act, 1776, of course, right? We declare our sovereignty by giving ourselves a law, right? It's a Speech Act, and right, you automatically create an inside, you're with us, or you are outside, right? You're not with us. But in fact, Agamben says you only push to the limits of this nation state, right? Indigenous people, undesirables, whoever, right? So you're not really outside because the state can still put you in a camp, put you in a reservation. So you're still within the geography of the state, you just pushed to the limits. So again, thinking of recent events, the heavily armed men dressed up like soldiers, and they're mostly men, right? We can talk about gender maybe in another panel here. They're mostly men. Those men see themselves as sovereign, right? So each one is in his own state of exception now. Right? Each one is standing on his own threshold, and each one is ready to kill in the name of his, and I say this in big letters here, in his sovereignty. Thank you.
Thank you, Oliver. And we would just kind of move on now to Martin. And so maybe we could switch the speaker's view and continue, and then bring you two into a conversation after Martin has finished his talk.
Okay, thank you very much, Manuela. And thank you, Oliver, for your opening remarks. And I will build on them quite directly. And I come to my topic in talking about Agamben today, inspired by some of his comments that he made last spring in relation to the lockdown in Italy. And as you will see, I have some critical questions to ask about the way in which he connects his theses that Oliver has just outlined on the state of exception and on bare life to his diagnosis in spring 2020 last year to the lockdown. I have some critical questions about these, but I want to say up front that I only have those because in general I have a lot of time for Agamben's analysis, and I think he makes a lot of compelling arguments about why this is a helpful framework to understand things that are happening in politics in the 20th and the 21st century. At the same time, I will ask today whether there are also some limits to where this model can be applied, and hopefully by perhaps delimiting it a bit more precisely than he himself does, perhaps that model can even gain more explanatory power. And I will share my screen so you have some slides to look at as I speak. And I will begin my ultimately critical take on Agamben by looking at Hannah Arendt as a, if you will, contrasting but overlapping overlapping foil for Agamben, and specifically her comments on freedom. And I'm looking at her essay, specifically What is Freedom? Essay from 1961, published in Between Past and Future. This was originally a lecture given at the University of Chicago, and an earlier version slightly different, also appeared in the Chicago Review in, I think, 1960, and then the next year the book chapter appeared, which is again slightly different, but it contains some of the it contains the main arguments. And I will not be rehearsing this article in total. I just want to present you with the main distinction she makes in this chapter between two different conceptions of freedom that she outlines. The distinction she makes is between what she calls the philosophical concept of freedom on the one hand and a political concept of freedom on the other. What she argues here is that the concept of freedom that has been most successful, most impactful in modernity, broadly conceived, or maybe we could say, in a sense, in the last, I mean, certainly since the Middle Ages, that's why I say broadly conceived, is the philosophical concept. And the philosophical concept of freedom, as she understands it, is to understand freedom as something inside of us. Yeah, freedom is understood as an inner attribute that attaches to our will and our thinking, our ability to think. And she traces the roots of this already to a Greek philosophy, which she says also kept the idea of had no use for the idea of freedom as political freedom. Yeah, and so to Arendt, so if you look on the right side of the slide, the concept of freedom that she wants to defend is that of political freedom. This is freedom as the ability to act in the public sphere. And she is saying that for philosophy, freedom has tended to signify really the ability to be free from politics, to be free by oneself, separated from a collective sphere. Yeah. And this has translated well, she says, also into ideologies such as liberalism that champion the individual, and the idea that individual freedom is really what is the key thing. And a key aspect of this philosophical ideal of freedom that has, by Arendt's lights, had such a successful career in conceptual terms, is the notion of sovereignty. Yeah? So the idea of individual sovereignty, that my free will is independent from that of others. I govern myself. Yeah? And government ultimately does not protect that freedom. Yeah? Government, she says, is ultimately concerned only with what she calls the life process. Yeah. Oops. So government will provide security, yeah, will govern the sphere of the necessity of life, yeah. But ultimately, freedom from the philosophical point of view, Arendt says, resides within myself. And Arendt does concede that freedom, as she understands it, it does require a certain liberation from necessity. Yeah? So in order to consider freedom as a political concept, you do need to rise above the sphere of, you could say, bare survival. Yeah? But she says it also requires the presence, the company of others, and public space as a venue. And she arrives at this incisive formulation that I think will surprise a few people, because it goes somewhat counter maybe to what we would expect. She says, if men wish to be free, it is precisely sovereignty that they must renounce. Yeah. So this flies to some extent in the face of how very often we would understand freedom, right? Where we would say freedom is exactly the opposite. Like freedom is if I declare my sovereignty, I declare the sovereignty to govern myself, to impose something on myself. The way Arendt understands freedom as a political freedom says I basically would have to give up this inward-based view of freedom. And so Arendt, with this idea of these two opposed struggling concepts of freedom, I want to turn to Agamben now, and his three very short columns that he published last spring in response, as I said, to the lockdown in Italy. And as a preface also, I want to remind everyone, of course, that the lockdown then was a lot more draconian, a lot stricter than what most people, certainly in the US, also in Germany, where I was at the time, experienced. So, I mean, I think we need to also, in the sense of fairness, need to keep that in mind in terms of his response. But his response drew immediately quite a bit of critical response and pushback. And I want to have that in a sense as a backdrop to our conversation today. I want to give you just a couple of formulations that he drawn from these three short texts. Then what I will do in a second step, I want to reconstruct what I think are his key arguments / complaints, drawing on some of the concepts that Oliver has outlined. And then in a third step, I want to ask 4 critical questions relating to these 4 critical complaints that Agamben brings forward. So first off, a few quotes, a few passages from those short columns translated into English. First one, you will recognize directly. He says, what is once again manifest is the tendency to use a state of exception as a paradigm for a government. So here we have the state of exception mentioned directly, and this is an affirmation of this idea, state of exception as a normalized way of government in the present. Yeah. Oops. The next quote is, oops, let me go back, couple too many clicks. This is where I want to be. In a perverse, vicious cycle, the limitations of freedom imposed by governments are accepted in the name of a desire for safety that was created by the same governments that are now intervening to satisfy it. Yeah, so the key concept here that I will look at is, of course, this idea that freedom is being limited by government. Third passage. It is also very likely that one will seek to continue, even after the health emergency, experiments that governments did not manage to bring to reality before, closing universities and schools and doing lessons and talks, symposia only online, putting a stop once and for all to meeting together and speaking for political or cultural reasons, and exchanging only digital messages with each other, wherever possible, substituting machines for every contact, every contagion between human beings. Then you have the very concise rearticulation of something Oliver also already mentioned. He says in one of these columns, our society no longer believes in anything but bare life. And now I need to try to move my picture The last quote I want to give you is, "The threshold that separates humanity from barbarism has been crossed." Yeah, so the threshold concept that Oliver mentioned right here, and Agamben connects it to this idea of barbarism, which of course has a large presence also in the Homo Sacer book. So let me condense this into four arguments in which I think Agamben links his general conception of presented in the State of Exception Homo Sacer books to the present moment. Number one concerns this idea of the state of exception itself. Yeah. The state of exception, as Oliver explained, as a political declaration of sovereignty. Yeah. So a state declares sovereignty by suspending individual sovereignty, individual practices, and thereby, says Agamben, establishes a norm, a quote, without any relation to reality. Yeah, this is a quote from State of Exception. I had the German translation to hand, Ausnahmezustand, by Agamben. The second point he makes in these quotations, he says government limits freedom in the name of safety. Yeah. This, I think, is very clearly what Arendt calls the philosophical concept of freedom. Yeah. So government is in effect not protecting freedom, but is really only concerned with the realm of necessity. Yeah. Or you could say the realm of bare life, as Agamben then says in a later quote. The third thing I want to draw out is his comments on the absence of public meetings. Yeah. This is described here as a politically motivated limiting and transforming communication in the public sphere. And finally, the last couple of quotations on bare life. And he says that human society that is concerned only with survival, yeah, only with bare life, in essence, is not worthy of being called society. It's a disfiguration of the social beyond what we can or should accept. So let me ask 4 questions that we can maybe then begin to discuss based on these 4 arguments that, or complaints or criticisms that Agamben expresses. And so the questions are motivated by, I would say, a partial overlap with some of the diagnoses by Arendt, but also by a difference between the two in certain places. So I'm not, and I wouldn't call it an explicit contradiction or dispute on every front. Yeah, but I think it's there are some shared diagnoses, and there's also difference. So with respect to his idea of the generalized state of exception as he applies it here to the present moment, I want to ask, isn't part of the problem of this idea of a normalized and generalized state of emergency or state of exception that it becomes difficult to count anything as an actual emergency, right? So if everything's already covered by this borderline concept, how can we respond if there should be anything that we might want to say is special or different Are we really prepared to say with Agamben that a pandemic is an invented, and so that's his word, and that's his in one of the title of one of the columns, an invented rather than a real emergency, just because the experience of totalitarianism has made us believe even more strongly that freedom begins where politics ends. This last bit is Arendt's observation, right? So she says that the experience of having experienced totalitarianism might really motivate us to think that we want to stay away from politics. Yeah, we want to steer clear of politics as much as possible and limit the concept of freedom to the individual, to the private realm. Yeah, that's not the answer or the reaction that Arendt herself proposes, but she says, you know, that's a conclusion some people might draw. Question number 2. So this is drawing on his formulation that government is limiting freedom. I have the following question. For Arendt and Agamben, politics and society respectively are about more than just assuring security and survival. But if, as in this case, security is not just a private concern of my life, if my action potentially endangers the life of others, then safety itself is a genuine political issue. I can only act among others, which is Arendt's understanding of freedom, if their life and ability to act is not compromised by mine. On the last page of State of Emergency, Agamben suggests that true political action is, quote, a pure medium that shows only itself, unquote, and does not issue obligations, orders, or prohibitions. But such a self-display of political action, I would say, would always and necessarily have to include a plurality of selves. Yeah, so how would this work? My third question is in response to his observation of the radical curtailing of meeting freely in public. Yeah. I share Agamben's reservations about a prolonged public life at a distance. So, you know, clearly he has a, I think his concern is shared by many. But as Arendt's analysis shows, Agamben's concept of freedom, which he sees imperiled by government, may in fact owe more to the individual perspective of an already isolated will than that of action as part of a human collective where the world is at stake. Yeah, so that's Arendt's understanding of what's at stake in politics, yeah, in the political. So my question here isn't Agamben already arguing from a certain point of individualization and isolation? And finally, my last slide and my last question. Agamben's suspicion that Zoe, as Oliver brought it up, so Zoe as opposed to bios, yeah, Zoe as the life as it is lived, yeah, rather than bare life, that Zoe is under a general threat of elimination, ultimately contrasts with Arendt's qualified openness towards the unforeseeable or unpredictable in the political realm. Arendt writes, and so I give you this one quote here from What is Freedom? The more heavily the scales are weighted in favor of disaster, the more miraculous will the deed done in freedom appear. For it is disaster, not salvation, which always happens automatically, and therefore always must appear to be irresistible. So when Arendt here talks about disaster, it's pretty general, you know, and a lot could be grouped under this. But her point is basically that any human action from a certain point of view is special, yeah, is exceptional, is a miracle. You can almost think of that in terms of thermodynamics. Yeah, so that the general trend would always run towards disintegration and chaos. Yeah, and that we're able to act at all is from that point of view miraculous. And so maybe we need to ask, might one such miracle be a voluntary and we should probably stress temporary suspension of acts to which will and thought individually might feel entitled. Thank you very much. Let me try to stop sharing here.
Thank you very much, Martin.
It's my, oh, here. So.
All right. I would like, before we start a discussion, I'd like to encourage our audience, please. I've seen we have quite a number of participants here. Please write your questions into the Q&A box so we can have a true conversation amongst each other. So there's a lot of time still left that we can use to have a conversation. Now, as a moderator, as a host of this panel, I'm really tempted, Martin, to give your questions, all of them, to Oliver and challenge to answer them. But this is a big deal. So I want to put this here as a starting point, but I have a couple of questions to maybe that tie in with what you said. And I want to kind of ask Oliver, I was struck by your image at the end that you left us with in your talk, right? The image of heavily armed men. And I think we all know that image. It's kind of just recently, right, at the Capitol in Washington, of heavily armed men asserting their freedom. And you kind of, but you described this in terms of an I, of an individual, right? But what I hear when I see the images and hear what they say is we, you and we. I mean, you have done this to us and this is why, right? So I just kind of want to have you talk a little bit more, right?
Okay.
All right. So asserts itself to the we. Can I ask this to you? And for Martin, I have a question that relates to the big point of our speaker series, right? Just kind of asking about the new normal. And you asked this also, but I'd like you to elaborate a little bit on that too. So our speaker series is the new normal, Germany and the US, right? If the state of emergency, Martin, is the new normal.
All right, so who should I go first, since you asked me the question first?
So what then?
Okay, so
what do we do?
first, we will, when we put this on the web, the recording of this event, I think we will put the links in so you can read Agamben's opinionated pieces by yourself. I read it, of course, and yeah, I have some reservations myself. So when you read it, in one point, actually asks the church, of course, he's Italian, that the Catholic faith says, well, are you guys supposed to martyr yourself, right? And there's a little bit of this, hey, speak about yourself, buddy, right? Who wants to be a martyr? But for now, for this panel here, let me play the devil's advocate. And again, when we publish this, I want a little sign here next to me that says Advocatus Diaboli. So I'm speaking as Agamben here, not as myself. As I said, myself personally, I have some reservations. But let me defend Agamben a little bit. I would say, and this comes also back to Manuela's question. So again, there is this shift, and the way Agamben sees it, I would say really this sovereignty becomes almost like it attaches to everybody. It's almost like a parasitical entity, right? So every one of these men playing soldier, right, who appeared in Richmond already a year ago for a so-called, I think they call it Advocacy Day or something like that, or Lobby Day or something on not coincidentally, I think, MLK Day. in 2020 already, and you can look at those images online, and I saw them basically heavily armed. So this is the National Guard, but no, they dress up as soldiers, which of course is important because, right, if you're in a war, if you kill somebody in the war, this is not a murder, right? I mean, this is as old as time, right? This is a state of emergency you're in on the battlefield, and nobody would in any way prosecute somebody, a soldier who's done his duty to defend his homeland, which again I think is very typical then, right? So it becomes the state of emergency. This threshold is kind of shrinking. It used to be, here we are, our nation, and then there are the others, colonial times, right? Now we are here really in post-modernity, right? That threshold shrinks around me. I'm my own, and this is of course, I refer here to the stand your ground law, right? So wherever I am, I can stand my ground and quote unquote defend myself, right? So there's this kind of really a great explanatory power that Agamben has. And secondly, I see also Agamben, he seems to be right. So right this morning, every morning I open the paper and I see in the Guardian, I see a long article on Amazon and how basically the workers are more or less treated by machines. They don't even get bathroom breaks in the Amazon warehouses, according to the Guardian reporter. And I also read an article in the Chronicle of Higher Education, which is, the audience knows that basically the publication every college professor has to read more or less. And they had a thing of that state houses now renew scrutiny of speech at public colleges and try to, for example, directly cut into seminars that, for example, cover Black Lives Matter or other social movements. So they want to have a say in this. And very telling, I think, is if you don't do what we say, and this is, I think, here in Ohio, I see quoted, I see Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Iowa, yeah. It's basically, we cut your state funding, right? So it comes again back to capitalism here. So that's basically my kind of defense of Agamben. So as harsh he might sound, he is a philosopher, right? He sees things on the level of philosophy. And I think when I read he still believes, and as a Democrat, I think you must believe in this utopia of a mature citizen, right? So somebody who is, in German, I would say der mündige Bürger. So the citizen who is educated and basically can contain himself or herself, can say, well, I'm not going on my usual summer vacation. And this is, of course, our Martin, my native Germany, right? It looked at the beginning as, okay, the Germans have it all done, you know, lower COVID cases than pretty much anywhere else, right? Everybody plays by the rules. Well, then come the summer and the Germans, well, we can't live without our summer vacation. So, right, huge spike, which disappointed me really. And Martin probably too, right? So there is an ideal in Agamben. He says, well, maybe we have to still believe, if we believe in democracy, we have to believe in that ideal citizen who actually can say, yeah, it's my freedom. I could go out in the street and party, but I'm not for the greater good. Even though the reality, of course, looks quite different.
Yeah, so I think I want to, Oliver, I first want to respond to you directly, a couple of points, also partially amplifying what you said rather than contradicting you before I get to Manuela's question. So first off, in terms of the final sort of scene that you painted in your remarks, that I was also very struck by, you know, somebody dressing up as a soldier and trying to establish what Agamben would probably call like an empty space, yeah, between you know, they're setting a certain norm under the threat of violence, carrying around you know, a semi-automatic, but that of course it only works because the state at that moment draws back, recedes, so there's a certain other norm that is not enforced. Yeah. And so here I think I would agree that Agamben's analysis is helpful, to make us see this, but it also shows, of course, that this is not, even though these people who do this, they might believe that they are engaging in political free speech, and of course, there's this permanent invocation of the Second Amendment, et cetera, but this is not really this is not politics. It certainly is not politics by Arendtian lights. Yeah. Politics would be also an engagement with what is happening there, rather than just a shrinking back from it, and that's maybe something that is missing. So if Agamben frequently, also in the columns and also in the books, he often says, well, where are the jurists, right? Where are the jurists when we need them? Yeah, I mean, I think this would be a case in point. Your second point in terms of Agamben perhaps building on something like almost Kantian notion of a mature citizen. I mean, I think this is probably true, but it is then also utopian. Then, of course, if we see that things are playing out differently, then I think we're forced to perhaps adjust our theoretical view of it a little bit, rather than saying, well, what people should be doing is they should refrain. And in a certain sense, that's in my last question. So that's, in a certain sense, you rephrased, my question, but Arendt, terms a miracle, if this kind of self-restraint, and the idea, well, can I suspend, in the name perhaps of maturity, Mündigkeit, certain rights that I might feel I individually have under the individual concept of freedom, rather than insisting on this and saying freedom comes first, and that's why I'm asserting my individual perspective, and I don't care ultimately about the collective perspective. And that's just something that I've really seen in this past year that's really struck me, and that's changed my perspective a little bit. But I absolutely think that in a lot of cases, also, and the ones that you've cited, where Agamben's analysis is absolutely helpful, but there I think it's not so much that the collective perspective perhaps is imperiled, but and I think Agamben usually also he argues from the point of view of, you see, those that are genuinely marginalized. Yeah. And that's not necessarily what I've seen in a lot of the sort of conflicts that are happening this year. Thirdly, to Manuela's question, is this the new normal? So we have, of course, with everything that has happened over the last months, there's a very complex entwinement of different difficult phenomena. Yeah. So, and I mean, my immediate gut reaction would be that I think Agamben's analysis does help us describe some of what is happening, such as the examples Oliver gave, and also wakes us up to maybe the limitations of in liberal democracies of thinking, well, all we just need is an informed citizenry, and then they will make the right decisions by themselves. I would say my personal confidence in this has taken a hit over the last year. Yeah, and if that's what the diagnosis is, then we have the question of what comes next. Yeah, but I am somewhat uncomfortable with some of the conclusions that Agamben then drew in direct response to, and I think his response came out of his long since held beliefs / diagnosis of modernity, which is, it's not that that's wrong all of a sudden. I don't think it is, but I think it has at least the danger of giving more of legitimizing some of the very things that he probably doesn't stand for, or wouldn't want to legitimize. If I make the argument that government is predominantly here in the business of limiting freedom, that's exactly what the people that Oliver is describing, that's what they're saying. Yeah, and so I think there are some problematic consequences coming out of some of the arguments that Agamben is making.
And
to both of you, this is very interesting. Oliver, do you want to respond, or do we want to take some questions from? No,
just right. I'm just a little anecdotal thing too for the audience. I saw a question about the German Reichsbürger. So just to make sure nobody thinks that we are only blaming it on recent American events, right? So in Germany, there's also a movement. They call themselves citizens of the Reich. And I think you all get what's implied here, who basically says, well, the German government has no legitimate power over me. I want to be free. I want to stop paying taxes. I want to live on my own. I want to arm myself, which most of you probably know is highly regulated in Germany due to fascism and all of that. So just to put things in perspective, so these type of people everywhere in the world right now. So this is probably also something we need to think about, is that this seems to be rather a global phenomenon, and not just a kind of German problem or American problem or German-American problem. It's basically this type of populism, some have called it, seems to be going global here. Right.
So that was, Oliver, I understand you just responded to the question in a German context. I'm wondering about the positioning of the sovereign citizen that is Reichsbürger, where does that come from, right? What does that mean? So that was the first question. I understand you responded to this. Martin, do you want to respond to this too, a little bit, like the idea of Reichsbürger, of sovereign citizens, or? Yeah,
I do see it as a parallel phenomenon to the example that Oliver gave. Yeah, so this idea that declaring individual sovereignty, or in this case a very small, rather small, fortunately, group, and I think it's a perfect demonstration of to what extent sovereignty, as Arendt explains it, can be problematic. Yeah, it can be a threat to political expression, because it reduces basically the public realm to something like a battle of wills. I mean, that's also how she explains this, right? So if I convince myself that certain laws just should not apply to me, and that's the image that I form, and I declare my sovereignty based on that generated idea, yeah, and I then go out and in a battle of wills, and if worst comes to worst, in a battle of actual violence, or storing, as in some of the Bundeswehr soldiers, in a storing of massive amounts of ammunition that I've illegally diverted, that's genuinely frightening, but it becomes, I think, the tricky problem that is thrown up by this is that it becomes more difficult to say than what perhaps our immediate reaction would have been, to always think that sovereignty is a good thing, right? And that's traditionally we would have said, yeah, well, people should be able to declare themselves independent and free. And I think this is pushing us. This is pushing us to maybe rethink this a little bit.
Okay, so that's, thank you. So I'm going to kind of ask a couple of questions that the audience posed now, and so we know which question we are answering. I'll just read the question. All right, so the first question by Francis Longacker, sorry if I mispronounce it, and it's about digital landscape and media. In what ways might the current digital landscape influence, especially social media, Arendt's conception of freedom from the political sphere? It appears, for example, that one can attempt to evade the rhetorics of social media, but cannot even truly get by in daily life without some digital connection. Is philosophical freedom a greater risk today because of the requirement to live digitally to some extent, particularly during this pandemic? And what are the implications for trying to live more than a bare life? I just throw this to both of you. Very interesting question.
Should I go first? Yeah, so first of all, I think when you said, is philosophical freedom at greater risk today? I think what you meant to say is political freedom at a greater risk today, because so for Arendt, you know, the ability to act within a plurality in the public sphere, that's you know, her understanding, her more fully applicable in her mind conception of freedom that doesn't reduce us just to isolated individuals. And yeah, I think your question absolutely articulates a big challenge, essentially, because as many people have noted, you know, social media is very much a misnomer. You know, I think asocial or anti-social media would be in many ways a much better term for what is happening. And so here too, you know, I share Agamben's you know, reflex of being skeptical of this, being afraid of this, and we've seen, you know, so many ways in which this kind of interaction can be manipulated so that it does not qualify as reasoning in the company of others, as Arendt would understand, you know, the political sphere. Rather, it is manipulation and disinformation and really trying to prohibit or at least curtail thinking as much as possible. So I think the challenge would be, is there, to not be completely negative about this, is there a way in which we can shape in the future, hopefully in the near future, we can shape these systems so that they can be more of a tool for the kinds of interactions that we would want to see in real life. And, you know, I mean, it's because it's very common that we see, you know, people would do things online that many of them would never do in person. Some of them would, okay, and that's also troubling, but many wouldn't. So how can we change the look and functioning of these systems? And of course, this goes to the fact that these are in the hands of gigantic and enormously powerful and rich multinational corporations who have no intrinsic interest in maybe changing the way these systems function. So it is probably incumbent upon the body politic itself. And I mean, Europe is a bit farther along in this than the US in basically forcing some of these corporations to start, you know, in small baby steps, reforming how these systems work.
Yeah, it's one of the things I always wanted to do is reread my Leibniz. I feel the last years we all became monads, right? So Leibniz, as you know, is this famous concept of the monad, right? So we're floating all in your little bubble here, and then it seems to me almost as if the social media then became this kind of godlike entity that connects us all, right? So we don't have this clear view, right? We're all just living in our own little bubble here. And as Martin said, this is a troubling issue. And one thing that I would bring forth is actually my personal critique of Agamben, that he doesn't mention capitalism as much as I would like him to. Right? So there's I think a really strong moment here of that postmodern capitalism that Jameson already described 30, 40 years ago. Right? I think this is for me the troubling development here too, is that our bodies become also that side of that homo saga. Does it make money? Yes or no? This becomes a kind of a switch. If it doesn't make money, right, it's basically dispendable, right? There's the new homo saga is the one, I believe, also in our daily life, that if you're no longer productive, there you go. And this goes, I think, straight back to also all these rumors that we read on social media, right? Oh my God, will all those lefties bring us into re-education camps, right? That people sit somewhere in a little bubble and they seem to believe this. Yes, there will be a new state of emergency now proclaimed by the newly elected, legally elected government of the United States, and will put everybody who's right of the middle into a re-education camp, which is right. So this I think is for me one of the problems, is that we, in that whole digital realm, as Martin rightfully remarked, right, as there's a lot of money at stake, right? Especially during the pandemic, I had to shop with Amazon, right? There was no way around to get what I really needed. Right? You need, I don't know what, a cable for your computer. I'm not driving out to Best Buy and put 2 masks on and risk my life, my family's life, right? So I order it with a click, and forget, of course, about the worker who has to put this. I mean, I repress it, right? There's a lot of repression also going on in this realm of the social media, where you said, well, it's all one-click shopping, but somebody has to physically take the cable, put it in the box, write my name, address, and it send it to me, and then I get charged for it. Right? So there's, I think, also a point in that we all tend to forget. So that was my.
Okay, thank you. And I want just to say that we are at 1 o'clock. It's 1 o'clock now, and we had said if we have questions in the discussion, we would go a little bit over, and we still do have 2 questions, and there might be more if you still have questions. So I want to go to the question of Chandra Conover. And you 2 panelists can all read it too, but I just kind of want to put it out here. It's a question about the freedom to make bad choices, maybe going back to the internet, but to the social media, but beyond. So if I'm understanding this correctly, Arendt stated that freedom requires a renouncement of sovereignty and also heightened concern for the security of others and the public space. With that in mind, what do you think about, what do you think of the idea of freedom as the freedom to make bad choices? So probably Martin, would you?
Yeah. Should I go first? So first of all, yes. So you're saying correctly that she thinks to be truly free, we need to renounce sovereignty. So the question about the security of others, that was something that I added on, because it seems to me that the kind of exchange that she has in mind in the public sphere can only take place if the security in a certain way is assured. And as we've seen this past year, so if that's not assured, and of course the threat could be all manner of things, but so the virus this year has been, it's a fitting I think example to take, that impacts the ability to exercise political freedom as Arendt sees it, and the freedom to make a bad choice. Yeah, absolutely, that is part of freedom. I think the paradox where I feel that perhaps Agamben trips up a little bit is that you do have to think about whether the bad choice that I make is then a choice that is also bad for others. Yeah. So of course I can make the individual choice, for example, to not participate politically. I can self isolate, and that's fine. I can try to be as much as I can a non-political animal, so to speak. To a certain degree, I can probably do that. But if my action or if my bad choice starts to really impact the way others can express themselves and can be acting in the public sphere because I want to walk around without a mask, without any concern, and so on and so forth. Just as an example, that would be detrimental to politics. And so there, I think the problem rises above just the question of mere security, which I think Agamben, he sort of downplays that a little bit, as though as well, when he talks about, well, you have to be courageous, and you have to just be willing to risk your life if it's really important to you, okay, but do you therefore also get to risk the life of somebody else? That seems to me problematic.
Oliver, would you like to add?
Yeah, I agree. So again, personally, as I said before, I have some reservations with Agamben as he expresses himself in these articles. And I took the role to defending him here. So just that aside, I absolutely agree with you, Martin. It becomes once my bad choice is my bad choice is getting completely drunk, which is okay. It's your own liver. But then if I step into a car, right, it's a whole other level of right and drive. And I said, after 5 whiskeys, I'm still good to drive, right? So this is basically the level of the difference, and I'm stepping into the realm of the public. And then, of course, my bad choice will affect others once I crash my car, right? So there's this kind of problem here that Agamben, I think, I don't know if he personally is really so tough that he would actually go out and say, I'm going to risk my life, or especially at his age, right? Will he say my parents who probably are roughly his age, right? Will they self-isolate at home and don't go shopping anymore, basically? So there's the question if he personally will do that. One thing to come back to the question we had before about the new public sphere of the social media, maybe there should be more often engaged discussion here that is not on Twitter. So I really don't like these limited Twitter back and forth, because for me there is this kind of strange thing. It's almost like a shock, right? Those of us who have read our Benjamin know what I mean, right? It's this kind of shock. Somebody says something, oh my God, right? And then people pound on it, they promote it, it gets voted down, people get all emotional about it, and then the next shock happens. Right? There is no real discussion for me on Twitter. It seems to be almost a little bit like yes, we are alive, I'm alive, therefore I tweet. So for me, Twitter would be an example where you have a life reduced to this kind of electronic digital blip. Hey, tweet, I send out, how many characters are we now on? From 144 to whatever, right? Now there's this like posting my vacation on Instagram. So even though I had a horrible time, I of course Photoshop this, put it out there. Here I'm at the beach, wonderful. So that seems to me a little bit for me the problem personally of that move to the digital/social sphere here.
Thank you. We have a question actually from VCU, from somebody at VCU, Oliver, your university, and it's about authenticity and about Arendt too. So Arendt draws a lot of interest here. Would Arendt differentiate between philosophical and political freedom in terms of the authenticity of one or another expression? That is, would she characterize philosophical, individualistic, or selfish freedom, such that we encounter in the alt-right's recent protests, as a false sort of freedom, whereas political freedom is more substantive or authentic due to its being validated by consensus among those who share it? So, throw it out to you, whoever wants to go first. Take it.
Okay, I'll take it first.
Okay.
Without certainly wanting to silence Oliver. So authenticity is not a word that Arendt uses in this context. I also think she wouldn't necessarily think that in order to be of substance, it would need to be validated by consensus. So the political realm is, you could say, fundamentally animated by dissensus, yeah, by competing points of view, by difference, and that's absolutely fine. But it is true by her lights, as you say, that it is fundamentally non-selfish in the sense that it is directed outward. Yeah, so it and because it is focused on action, yeah, and not just on locking myself up in my own, you could say, worldview and just disregarding the presence, and we can also say that the diversity of others. And if you want to, again, it's not a word that Arendt uses, but if you want to think of people's selves as, authentic selves in some sense, it would probably mean something like having the ability to act and to express themselves where otherwise they could not. Doesn't necessarily mean that others have then to fall into line or have to agree with it.
I can only answer briefly to that because I'm not Agamben. I'm not an Arendt expert. For Agamben, I think the answer would be very brief, right? He says this in several occasions, right? When Martin brought it up, we humans, we are the political animal, right? Our life is political we basically curse to that by virtue of language. And I think it takes a lot from Foucault Foucault's concept of biopolitics, of course, is at the center of Agamben's project. So and you can read up on it. There's all kinds of the Foucauldians who disagree with Agamben's reading of Foucault, but back basically, right? So our bios, our life is connected, for better or worse, to being a political animal. So there's no way around that. We can't. That's the one freedom we cannot have. We cannot dissociate ourselves from politics, not ourselves voluntarily. It can be taken away from us paradoxically, but we ourselves, we would have to move into a little hut and become named Ted Kaczynski, right? So we would have to, so to say, almost in a psychotic state of mind. That would be the only way to free ourselves from politics.
In a couple of examples that Arendt gives in the essay of a removal from politics, she says, is a tribal society or a household, which she basically gives as examples of fundamentally non-democratic venues, right, where there's not free expression. So the father, yeah, you know, she doesn't say this. I mean, and I'm sort of saying this tongue in cheek, but you know, the father enunciates the law. Oliver will know what I'm talking about, and so you know, so I think the reason Arendt also prizes the political so much and sees in it the potential for freedom is because there we are not chained, or we're not connected to our immediate origin, right? So she says, you know, the household, or you know, the original, the tribal context, that's for her still like the sphere of necessity, you know. Whereas if we step out into a public sphere that is worthy of being called that, we are free to act in a way that you know, we might not be if we're part of for example, of a domestic hierarchy where we're yeah, not free to do as we wish.
That's thanks for the example. You know, I'm just through my mind all the times in the last, especially the last few weeks, when I heard this kind of, that's so unfair, you know. Right, of course, then I have to tell my kids, you know, this is not a democracy. But I thought about one other example that would work very well, since again my train of thought was from family to my kids who play Fortnite, which they use also to connect digitally to their friends, and it's quite interesting since they all yell, it's quite interesting to overhear their conversations over that. And it is, Fortnite, I think, is also a very much game that expresses that state of exception, right? So you parachute into an island, you know, there's this storm that will kill you. Of course, I think here of COVID, and then it is a fight, especially in the Battle Royale edition, you know, the last man standing or last person standing. I think you all know that, you know, you have your avatar, which is, the avatar is mostly gendered, but the player, of course, can all, my boys can play with, you know, a female avatar, no problem. But that, I think, is also quite interesting to see in the household, basically, how I think you can no longer talk about an oikos, right? My oikos is so linked to the economy, as in employment, whatever will our universities decide to go for furloughs or even lay off people? Will departments be shut down? Programs are on the chopping block, right? So there is a little bit of that disaster capitalism going on that Agamben seems to think about. So there is, I think, you can no longer be free of that in your own household, right? You have to tell, for example, if you have kids or somebody else dependent on you, well, so we can't afford that right now, right? Whatever it is at the moment, right? From, if you're in a good situation, it's a luxury good, say, I don't know what, yet another Fortnite character skin, or if you're in a bad situation, you know, you can't afford the ice cream after dinner, or even worse, right? So it's, I mean, I see in Richmond public schools, they deliver thousands of meals, right? So it's an interesting thing for me too, to see how that suddenly affects education. So vast resources in the Richmond public school systems are dedicated to deliver food to the kids and their family. Right? So whenever there's a snow day, there are lots of emails, phone calls. Okay, tomorrow you won't get a meal delivered. Right? That's the kind of strange state where suddenly there is no longer a public or a private sphere. Right? So the government, if you want to call it that way, or the life has us firmly in its sphere of influence. So I think there I would definitely agree with Agamben. Well, we have to resist that. Right? How come that Richmond Public School is forced to deliver thousands of meals, for example? Right?
Thank you. I'd like to close with the two questions that are still open, and maybe start with a question that is for Martin, and then conclude with a last question for both of you. So for Martin, as you know, and I was wondering for these two names coming up. I was waiting for it, and now they're here. So at the very end, we'll still do this. As you know, Benjamin refers to a real state of exception in the concept of history, which can be seen as a bitter retort to Carl Schmitt's political thought and affiliation. I appreciate your question about Agamben's use of the term and wonder if you could comment on how to distinguish a real state of exception in Benjamin's sense. So I would like, Martin, I would like you to answer that. And then at the end, hopefully, maybe we can even end on a positive tone, but I don't know whether we'll get there. The last question, I'm wondering about the influence on Arendt of Kant's discussion of personal autonomy being limited by social responsibility. So first question for Martin about Benjamin and Schmitt, and then at the end, Kant's influence on Arendt regarding personal autonomy and social responsibility. And I would assume with this, then we'll close our panel. So Martin first.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I don't think I can do justice to it immediately, but I will say that you know, I mean, I think the situation that that Benjamin has in mind is he has a. I mean, he in the text. I mean, he looks at the, you know, history as a sort of a cascade of disasters that have happened, and so something to which we need to respond. Yeah. And so if we, you know, whether we you know, pick one particular example, as I now did with you know, Agamben's response to this health, what he calls, you know, the health emergency, or we you know, broaden it out to include other ones in one way or another, I would say, you know, this is something that's real here is something that we see and that we need to respond to. So I think in Benjamin's later thought, that really comes to the fore, yeah, in a way in which it in his earlier thought, even when he you know, makes reference to Schmitt and includes him in his thought in the Trauerspielbuch, that's not really quite there yet. So I think maybe towards the end, Benjamin was rethinking this also a little bit, and in a way, I'm doing a bit of a repetition here if I'm trying to rethink and then not thereby completely invalidate Agamben's project, which I think applies to many of the examples that we have given. But if you know, a generalized state of exception would mean that something like the pandemic happens, and we, you know, because we are so skeptical of totalitarian overreach of the state, that we, you know, that our conclusion would be, well, no, the state shouldn't do anything. Everybody should just carry on as normal, because otherwise, you know, it's an undue limitation of freedom. I think that's in a certain sense closing our eyes before reality. And so if Agamben, therefore, you know, he titled as one of his pieces "The Invention of a Pandemic," that's where my ears sort of went up a little bit, because you know, that's a divorcing from the real that I'm not sure that I'm quite comfortable with.
If I can cut in briefly, once we post this, I will put some links to. I mean, Agamben actually went through a lot of trouble tracing down and tried to really prove that Schmitt and Agamben had a closer relationship, which is mind-boggling to begin with, right? So here's the later Nazi jurist and enabler, if you want, really looking up to and actually talking or corresponding with Walter Benjamin, as you know, famously killed himself, fleeing the Nazi regime. Where, right, so I would say what if I understand Benjamin correctly, right, the only way out there is the miracle that was mentioned by Martin before, right? So there's of course this famous piece on the divine power, right? The Gewalt. There's this famous, really complicated piece that Benjamin published, and Derrida commented on it. A lot of other people tried to read it. What I remember is that, right, there is this Gewalt, this power that can come from a real revolution, right? So if enough people just say, okay, that's it, we had it enough, we had enough of being paid minimum wage or below minimum wage, right? This is I think also a troubling development, that lately you're no longer just a worker, right? I mean, Benjamin still lived with this, hey, you go into a factory, you might be exploited. But now you're supposed to be your own independent contractor, right? This is another one of these weird states of emergency that directly go onto your body. You basically, you can rent out yourself, so to say. And if you work for $2 an hour, so be it. Right? So Benjamin would say, well, the only way to cut through all of that, in a way also to cut through that Schmittian thinking of this binary, you in or out, your friend or enemy, is basically a divine power, if you want, that the real revolution, when the people stand up and say, okay, we had it, that's it. No, not anymore.
Sorry, I'm muted. Thank you. So we have this one last question open about the influence on Arendt of Kant's discussion of personal autonomy being limited by social responsibility. So that's our concluding question. And we have about 5 minutes to share between the two of you. Whoever wants to go first.
Well, Martin, that's on you, really.
Yeah, it's on me, okay. Happy to oblige. Well, you know, I think what you're making reference to here is the Beantwortung der Frage, was ist Aufklärung essay, right? Where you know, Kant is trying to walk a very fine line between saying on the one side, okay, the mature individual should first of all take it upon themselves to speak freely. Kant is particularly thinking about, of course, publishing here in this context. Yeah, making their thoughts known to the world via the writing of books. Yeah, and that should not be curtailed. Yeah, whereas on the other hand, he says there is another use of reason that is curtailed, and that's, I think, what you're referring to with, you know, so the aspect of social responsibility. Of course, to make it to align it very closely to Kant's own case must make us uncomfortable, right? Because you could say Kant really is accommodating himself here to the fact that you know, the Prussian king is keeping him from saying certain things, and of course his successor would then very directly censor Kant and not let him write on religion when he would have. So I think there's a painful experience of Kant's in terms of you know, the negative consequences of responsibility, and it's fair to think that, you know, that's something like that, an overreach of the state such as that is something that Agamben has in mind when he says, well, you know, is this if our communication is limited now to a digital stream that can be observed or that can be channeled, are we in danger of you know, something like this in a technically more advanced form? In terms of Arendt, I mean, I would say, you know, that her vision in the context of what she hopes political exchange to be, I think she for one thing, she definitely does not discount the possibility that the political sphere can come under the influence of that sort of restriction or censorship, because she lived through she lived through it herself. But the I think responsibility, if responsibility is has a I think the place it has is that if the political sphere can function in the way in which she envisions, then of course there is a place for the consideration of others. It doesn't mean that every political system that we see, of course, lives up to that ideal. That is clear, and I mean Kant's own certainly didn't.
Oliver, any final concluding words?
No, I think we are really at the time limit, and I don't want to.
Yes. So I would like to thank both of you, Martin Klebes and Oliver Speck, for your ideas and interpretations, for sharing what you know with us. I'd like to thank the audience for the questions and for staying with us. I'd like to thank Marcel Rotter, who was here as kind of the person who has all the kind of the technology under control. I hope you will seek us out on our website, the Collaboratory of German Programs in Virginia for our next event. I see Marcel Rotter just joined us. Hello, Marcel. Good to see you, and thank you, and bye-bye. Bye.
Thanks for having us, and thanks, Martin, for joining us all the way from the other side of this country.
Yeah, thanks for making it possible that we could have this conversation.
Right. Bye.
Bye.